Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Exploring Peaker Power Plant Inequities with Clean Energy Group's new mapping tool. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group, and we have a number of excellent guest speakers with us from a few excellent organizations. Before I pass it over to them, I'll go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone or join using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled on your screen here. You can also click on that arrow to expand the webinar console so that you can do things such as submit your questions and your comments. We will save some time for Q&A following our presentations, and we'd love to hear from you. We'll get to as many questions as we can. So again, do type in your questions and comments as you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email within the next 24 to 48 hours with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides. And we'll also put all of those materials on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. And that's a great URL to know because it's where we post not only all of our archived webinars, but also all of our upcoming webinars. So with that, I'll now pass it over to my colleague, Shelley Robbins. Shelley is a project director here at Clean Energy Group, and she is going to get us started.
Thank you, Samantha. As Samantha mentioned, this webinar is presented by Clean Energy Group, and Clean Energy Group is a national nonprofit, and our mission is to accelerate an equitable and inclusive transition to a resilient, sustainable, clean energy future. We help increase access to distributed clean energy technologies and accelerate the retirement and replacement of polluting fossil fuel infrastructure. And toward this end, we partner with a wide range of entities from community-based organizations working with frontline communities all the way to state agencies, utilities, and even federal agencies and national labs. And you can learn more about our work at, as Sam said, cleanegroup.org, where we have a ton of information and resources, including reports and past webinars. And speaking of resources on our website, today's webinar is about CEG's new Peaker Plant Mapping Tool, how it can be used to explore the economic and racial disparities of peaker plants. And we'll hear also from UPROSE, a community-based organization fighting peaker plants in the Sunset Park neighborhood of New York City, and the Berkshire Environmental Action Team, or BEAT, a nonprofit whose mission is to protect the environment for wildlife in support of the natural world that sustains us. BEAT has been leading peaker opposition efforts in Western Massachusetts. Now, our panelists today are Seth Mullendore, President and Executive Director of Clean Energy Group. Summer Sandoval is the Energy Democracy Coordinator at UPROSE. Summer leads many energy democracy campaigns, including developing Sunset Park Solar, which is New York's first community-led and owned community solar project, fighting peaker power plants with the Peak Coalition, which you'll hear more about from Seth, working on equitable offshore wind creation, and implementing a local just transition through UPROSE's community-led comprehensive waterfront plan called the Green Resilient Industrial District, or GRID. And from the Berkshire Environmental Action Team, BEAT, we have Rosemary Wessel, who is the program director of No Fracked Gas en Masse, a program of BEAT, a website, information and action plan clearinghouse for activists opposing fracked gas and other combustion-based infrastructure development in the Northeast. No Fracked Gas en Masse. So this current focus is pressuring peaker power plants to convert to grid-scale storage and clean energy sources. And with her is Jane Wynn, one of the founders and executive director of BEAT. She's led BEAT for the last 19 years, growing it from an all-volunteer activist group into one of the leading environmental groups in the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts. And then after we hear from our panelists, we will open it up for audience Q&A. So as Samantha mentioned earlier, please do type your questions when you think of them in the question box, and we'll get to as many as we can. And I will now turn it over to Seth.
Thank you so much, Shelley, and thanks everybody for joining us today. As Shelley said, I'm Seth Mullendorf, Clean Energy Group. So I'm going to share my screen here and walk you through our tool. So before I do that, I wanted to introduce Clean Energy Group's Phase Out Peakers initiative. So this tool was created as a part of our Phase Out Peakers initiative, which has been going now for a little over 4 years. For those of you that aren't that familiar with what a peaker is, they tend to be the power plants of last resort on the energy grid. Those stacks you see there on the website, those are peaker plants in New York City. We first got into looking at peakers, as I said, about 4 years ago, for a couple of reasons. One, so peakers are one of the most inefficient sources of energy in our system as well, and they're very, very expensive. When they do operate, they don't operate often. One of the kind of defining factors of a peaker is that it doesn't operate most of the year, only a small fraction of the time. And when it does operate, it only operates often for a few hours at a time or less, sometimes just for an hour or even less than that. They're called upon when the grid is stressed, when the energy system needs a bit more power and you got to pay for it. That can be during times of, say, when it's hot outside and people are using air conditioning a lot. Increasingly, that can happen in the winter when folks are more dependent on electricity for heating. It can also happen during grid disruptions of any kind. There can be power plant failures or disruptions that were unknown or unexpected, and you need peakers to come in and provide that excess power. So we got involved in this first because the price of batteries came down dramatically over the last decade. And it came to the point where more and more headlines were talking about how peaker plants represented kind of a ripe opportunity for batteries to come in and provide this needed service. They could provide enough power, a lithium-ion battery with 4 hours, or you're seeing lithium-ion batteries now that can do 6, 8, even 10-hour duration applications. That's the right amount of time to knock out most peaker power plants. And because they're expensive, batteries could compete head-to-head. And they're certainly a cleaner opportunity. That's the other reason we really got into this was, so these are not the biggest carbon emitters in the power fleet, although they do represent about a third of generation capacity, over 300 gigawatts across the United States. There are significant contributors to local pollution. And because they're needed where the load is, where people are using energy, they're often located in or very near population centers. So peakers are clustered around densely populated areas. That's I'll show when I move to the map here. And when we dug into where these are, what we found was that peakers are predominantly located in lower income areas. And they are often clustered around communities that have a high percentage of people of color. So not only was this a public health issue, it's also an environmental justice issue where some of our most vulnerable communities are disproportionately being impacted and harmed by the emissions and pollutants from these inefficient, expensive power plants. So this is our peaker power plant mapping tool. It is available on our website. You can go to our project page for phase out peakers and then click on the link for our peaker plant maps. It's available to everyone. First off, I just wanted to talk about where our data comes from for this. All the information that we use for this, there's a link here to the Environmental Protection Agency's power plants and neighboring communities mapping tool. Got that open here. It is a wonderful tool. They released this a couple of years ago, maybe a little over a year ago. We used it to update our old, outdated peaker map, which only showed where peakers are. It didn't provide a whole lot more information than that. This shows all the power plants in the US. You can see there's over 3,000 of those. And it provides a wealth of demographic information for the population surrounding those power plants as well. So I encourage anyone that wants to dig in deeper and get more information to check out the EPA's tool. And what we did was we took their information and created our peaker tool around it. So that's what you see down here is a peaker plant mapping tool. For our tool, we defined a peaker both by its size and how often it operates, which is called its capacity factor. So for size, it has to be at least 10 megawatts in size. Smaller things, we assume probably are things like a backup generator or maybe a combined heat and power system that may not be a peaker plant. And as far as the capacity factor, we use 15%. So that means that the power plant, out of all the 8,760 hours in a year, it's operating 15% of the time or less. That's about 1,300 hours a year. Now, the national average for all of these peaker plants, and you can see there's about 1,100 of them across the United States. The national average is about 3% capacity factor. That's about 300 hours a year that you're talking about. Many of them are far less than that, less than 1%, less than 100 hours a year. Important to note that the information from EPA right now in their tool, so the information that we have for this is based off of 2019 data. They are in the process of updating their information. When they have new information, we'll update ours, and we can send out a blast to everyone to let them know when this has been updated. So along with just general information, they also provide demographic information. So every symbol on here is a peaker power plant. Most of these are gas and oil. So every triangle is a gas plant. Every circle is an oil plant. You'll also see some pluses. Those are either biomass or coal. There are some flunker coal plants that are being operated extremely inefficiently and as peaker plants. These are huge sources of emissions that should be gone from our system. So when you scroll over one of these, when you put your cursor over one of these, you'll see this information box opens up. It's called the Tooltip. So this has all the information that we present about these peaker plants. Up in blue is the name of the plant. And I will note that these plants are often called a number of different names. So it's always good to verify where the plant is, how big it is, to see if it's the one that you know of in your backyard. I'll scroll around to different ones because these tooltips can come and go. In addition to that, it lists the utility that it serves, the nameplate capacity, which is the maximum power that this can provide to the grid. It also lists the primary fuel type. Some of these, particularly in the Northeast, see if I can find one. Some of these are dual fuel. Here's one where it's partially gas powered and partially oil. Also lists the capacity factor, how often it operates, and lists the annual emissions. So annual emissions, we've got a few things here. One is carbon dioxide equivalent. So this is not just CO2 emissions, not just carbon emissions, but anything that's a greenhouse gas. It looks at the 100-year warming potential. So things like methane are included in this. So not just the carbon dioxide emissions. Lists both the annual emissions for 2019 as well as the emissions rate. And the rate can tell you how dirty they are. Lists also for nitrogen oxides, NOx, both the annual amount and the rate. And the rate here is very important because this means that when these things are operating, they're spewing that amount of emissions per megawatt hour into surrounding communities. As I said, these things often operate in the summer. Now, NOx is a precursor to ground level ozone and particulates, both of which have severe public health impacts. They have severe cardiovascular effects and can exacerbate respiratory conditions. In summer months is when ozone production and particulate formation is the highest because there's so much sun. So they really exacerbate air quality on days when air quality is already at its worst and could be really significant contributors. And Summer may talk about this more in the context of New York City. And then below that, there's also sulfur dioxide, which again is a big contributor to a lot of respiratory conditions. Below that, we get into demographic information. I'm going to pull back a little bit and look at this map because we have 3 different versions of the map here based on the different demographic information that you could get. So there's the low income percentile, people of color, and then the demographic index percentile. These and all the information is explained down below a bit more in these pull-out boxes if you want more information about the power plants, the emissions, and the demographic information. I'll open this up just so that folks can know, so that can see the text right now. The demographic information, that's based on the total population within a 3-mile radius. So if you drew a 3-mile radius circle around each of these power plants, looks at that population. So for the low income demographic information, that's looking at defined as a household income less than or equal to twice the federal poverty level. So that's what it means when it says low income. People of color, EPA defines that as individuals not identifying as non-Hispanic white. And then the demographic index, the third one, it's actually just an averaging of low income and people of color. So you can kind of see how these the factors play together and the combined effect averaged over each other. The maps look at both percentages and percentiles. All of the color coding, the heat map of these are based on the percentiles. So you look at the percentages in these communities versus the national average. So this is the low income map that we're looking at. And so anything that's blue is below the national percentile. So there are fewer low income households than you would see on average across the United States. The darker orange it is the higher percentage of low income households. The thing that jumped out to us, and I'm sure it's jumping out to you as well, is there's a whole lot of orange here. In fact, when we looked at the information, and we have this in a table down below, 2/3 of the peaker plants in the United States are located in lower income communities. So these are communities where at least 29% of the households are defined as low income. The other striking thing, and this is in the information, in the emissions information, is that on average, the emissions rates are higher for these peaker plants that are in lower income communities. So this means that you've probably got the older power plants there, the less efficient ones, or the ones that burn dirtier things like oil burning peaker plants tend to be in these communities. So this is the disproportionate impacts we're talking about. Not only are there more peakers located in lower income communities where there are lower income households, but also dirtier peakers located in those communities. So we also have a tab for people of color. So it's the same map, same peakers, but a different demographic index. So this time looking again at the those households that are identifying as non-Hispanic or not non-Hispanic white. So anything but that is classified as people of color. So it looks a bit different in this side. You see a lot more blue, but what you do see is you see the orange and dark orange in areas where we know that people of color tend to be based. So this is around major population centers along the coasts. You'll see that in places like Detroit and Chicago, as well as generally throughout the southern part of the state. So when we looked at the information for the percentiles for people of color, what we found was also quite striking. It's not so much that there are more peaker plants in communities that have a higher percentage people of color population. It's that there are just more people around these. So these numbers are really quite striking when you see, communities where there are the fewest number of people of color, talking about 3 million people impacted. When you get into communities of color that are 31% identifying as people of color or above, again, it's almost 30 million. And then when you get above 65%, talking about another 17 million. So the vast majority of people that are impacted by the emissions from peaker power plants are in communities that are have a higher percentage of people of color than the rest of the United States. And the really striking piece of information we found from this was the emissions rate. For those communities that have the highest percentages of people of color, 65% people of color or above, the rate of NOx emissions, these extremely harmful emissions, are nearly double that of those communities, those peakers that have around the lowest percentage of people of color in their communities. Clearly, environmental justice disparity there. So I'm not going to focus much on the third, the demographic percentile. You can see, as you would expect, this looks like kind of a mix between the other two. We didn't dig in as much on these, but it is an interesting metric to look at if you want to see the combined effect of low income and people of color. So I'm going to go back to the low income percentile here and just talk a little bit about how you navigate the tool before I turn this over to our other presenters. So navigating tool is not all completely intuitive. You can use it using just your regular mouse. You can click and zoom in, click again, zoom in, or you can make a box to zoom in even further on something. If you want to go back to the original, there's this little navigation bar over here. The home will take you out to where you were. You can zoom out using this. There you'll see we've got Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. We did not forget those places as well. There are peakers there as well. You can zoom in. You can also change how your tooltip navigates. If you just want to shift things around, you can go to this panning one, grab it, shift it around. You can go back to the box and use that to zoom in on power plants. The other feature that we have is up at the top. If you're just focused on a state or multiple states, you can filter by that here. Say I want to see how many peaker power plants there are in New York and New Jersey. You can select those states, and it will show you here. There are 69 power plants there. You can zoom in and take a look at those. Head back out there. The other feature I wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of is it's all well and good to see and look at this, but a lot of people want to get at the information behind it, the data behind it. We would welcome you to go ahead and download it. That's easy to do here. If you scroll to the bottom of the map, there's this control panel here, and there's this box with an arrow. When you scroll over, it says download. So you click that. Then you can select multiple ways. Either you can get an image, we're fine if you want to do that, and here's the data. So if you click on that, it will open up a spreadsheet that has all that information. This is not always the most usable. If you hit download again, then you can look at your browser screen, and it should have downloaded for you the box around here, the CSV file. So this is basically this. If you click on this, it will open it up in Excel. Do that here, and there is all the information. Not all of this is completely intuitive, so please reach out to us if you have questions about any of these individual fields, and we'll be happy to answer that. The one other thing I wanted to mention that we have in here is that you can also easily open up a map of these power plants. Click on Google Map there, and it'll open it up, and you can see exactly what it looks like and what the surrounding area looks like. So while that loads, there's that power plant right there, which is a very handy tool. So with that, I just want to make a note that we welcome your feedback. We've made this tool for folks to be able to use, for people like all of you to use. We want to make it as usable and as easy to use as possible. So if there's things that you'd like to see here that you don't see here, things that seem wrong here, or things that you would like us to help you figure out how to do, please reach out. Can't promise we'll be able to do everything. We're limited by the information that EPA has and the capabilities of this is built with Tableau, but we'll try to do as much as we can. So thank you for your time. With that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Summer.
Thank you, Shelley and Seth. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Let's see if I can get this right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. Again, my name is Summer Sandoval, and I'm the Energy Democracy Coordinator at UPROSE. Today, I will be talking a little bit about Peak Coalition's work, and then pivot and talk a little bit specifically about UPROSE's recent victories fighting peaker power plants in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. Okay, if we can get the slide to change. Okay, here we go. A little technical difficulty. So first I want to introduce the Peak Coalition. So Peak Coalition is the first comprehensive and frontline community-led effort to replace polluting peaker power plants with renewable energy and energy storage solutions. Here is a slide of some of our recent reports. You can find all of them on our peakcoalition.org website. The members of the Peak Coalition include the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, the Point CDC, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, Clean Energy Group, and UPROSE. And as a member of both PEAK and the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, UPROSE was founded in 1966. We're Brooklyn's oldest Latino community-based organization, and we work at the intersection of climate change and racial justice. Okay.
I'm gonna try clicking on it 2 times. That might do the trick.
Okay, let's see. Okay, there we go. And maybe a double click is going to be the answer here. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because Seth already gave an amazing overview of what a peaker plant is, but just so we really emphasize on the really important parts here of why peakers are just so bad. Like Seth mentioned, they're old. Many of the peaker plants that are in environmental justice communities have been there for decades, for generations. They're inefficient and they burn very dirty and polluting fossil fuels, including fuel oil and frack gas, and they're really expensive. And they make bad air quality days even worse for environmental justice communities. And we know that this is one of the major reasons why the COVID-19 pandemic was an environmental justice crisis as well, as there were as communities were impacted by a legacy of pollution from many of these peakers. And like I mentioned, so this is a figure from Peak's first report, Dirty Energy, Big Money. And as I mentioned, they're really expensive, and that expense falls on ratepayers. And so the first Peak report found that in a 10-year period, that 4.5 billion, billion to B, was paid in capacity payments to these peaker plant operators. And so this is a really big issue. This is just one of many examples of inequities in our energy systems. And we know that peaker plants are overwhelmingly sited in low-income communities and communities of color. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about UPROSE's work fighting the 3 peaker power plants that are in the yellow circle there. There is Sunset Park, Brooklyn, on the southwest part of Brooklyn. It is also home to New York City's largest industrial waterfront. And so we're going to zoom in and take a look at those 3 peaker plants and the work that's been done there. Oop, okay, let me go back. Okay, so before we jump into the peaker plants, want to also talk about other local sources of pollution and environmental injustices. And so in addition to 3 peaker plants, Sunset Park has a lot of pollution from other sources that include the Gowanus Expressway. This is an elevated highway that traverses the community north to south. There are also multiple solid waste transfer stations, brownfields, and a new rise of giant last mile trucking facilities delivering e-commerce goods that have also been concentrated in environmental justice communities. So not only looking at pollution from the energy sector, but also understanding the cumulative burdens and the disproportionate health impacts that other sources of pollution, in addition to burning fossil fuels, have on environmental justice communities like Sunset Park. Oh, let's see. Clicker doesn't like me today. Okay, here we go. So Sunset Park is a large community of over 130,000. This is larger than some cities across the U.S. Sunset Park is a predominantly Latino and Asian community. The community is also largely working class and has a large immigrant population. Environmental injustices have caused generations of health disparities, and on this slide, these are some of the preliminary findings of UPROSE's climate and community health vulnerability assessment that we conducted since 2020 that really identifies what some of the chronic health impacts that people are facing, as well as impacts from COVID-19. And so as you can see, many of the respondents, and we also administered the survey in both Mandarin and Spanish and Arabic, and we had all of those responses translated, that many community members are have at least one chronic health issue that they are dealing with, and these health issues are exacerbated by the impacts of climate change, like extreme heat and not having access to green spaces or indoor cooling or having high electricity bills. So all looking at health in a very comprehensive and holistic framework, so that to really identify the root causes, and so that we're not just talking about inequities in our energy system, but how those inequities really show up in community well-being. And now let's look a little bit more at the energy system. So in addition to many of the sources of local pollution, most of New York's energy generation that's in New York City, the in-city generation, relies on burning fossil fuels when compared to upstate energy generation. There are also other systemic barriers to clean energy development as well. Historically, most of the solar incentive funds have been allocated to solar projects upstate compared to New York City. You see the two arrows really showing the very large discrepancy between the solar incentive funding and where renewable energy is being developed. So UPROSE has had a really long history of fighting peaker plants in Sunset Park, dating all the way back to 2001, actually. Here is a recent victory that I want to tell you all about. So back in 2019, the Astoria Generating Company, who is a private peaker plant owner of the two largest and oldest power plants in Sunset Park, the Gowanus plant and then the Narrows plant that is on a barge that is pictured on the right here, was seeking to repower their plants, which just means to build another fossil fuel plant over the old ones. And so the old plants were burning a mixture of fuel oil and frac gas, and the new proposed plant was going to be another gas-fired plant. And so with the support of Peak Coalition members, UPROSE led this opposition through an Article 10 process as an intervener, which is a process that allows communities, partner, and interested parties to really participate in the legal process of citing these plants. And so at the end of 21, after years of also fighting the repowering of these plants, the company announced that they were going to discontinue their repowering proceeding, which is amazing climate justice victory. And this was also on the heels of New York State's decision to reject two other permits for two other peaker plants in Queens and then in Danskammer. All of these major victories when it comes to denying and stopping peaker plant repowerings and permits is really, really leveraged by the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the most ambitious climate legislation in the country. UPROSE and New York Renews and other coalition members helped pass this piece of legislation back in 2019 and have been working with our coalition members and partners since 2019 to work on the implementation of this law and to make sure that, we're not only passing legislation, but we're implementing legislation in a way that is prioritizing environmental justice communities and not just looking at the power sources, but really the process in how things get decided and what things are being built. So this was a really big victory. And we know that business as usual leadership and decision making created these inequities in our energy system. So it's going to take innovative partnerships and really true co-governance models to address the past harms of fossil fuel pollution and extraction in environmental justice communities. This is another example where UPROSE and the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance partnered with the New York State Energy Agency for you New York-based people, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, to do a community-led energy study in Sunset Park that specifically looked at the energy load pocket in Sunset Park, looked at the peaker plants that are in the load pocket, and then identified distributed energy resource strategies to help replace the peaker plants. You can find this also on the Peak Coalition website. Okay, there you go. Sorry, a little sticking on the next slide button, but another amazing example of a co-governance model is the partnership between Peak Coalition and the New York Power Authority. This came out just a few months ago, so definitely check this out. This partnership was to study the economic and technological pathways to retiring all of the New York Power Authority's gas-fired peaker plants, which led to the solicitation that was released in April of this year that to call on proposals to replace a number of their plants with battery storage alternatives. Just another example of how climate policies have really been leveraged as a foundation for creating the energy future that we want to see. Okay. And so these are pictures of the 3 peaker plants that I talked about. This really, this slide has changed even in the last 6 months to being one that is really showing multiple climate justice victories. Today, as it stands, all 3 of these peakers are planned to go offline. Few as early as by the end of 22, which is really exciting. And these plants have been in the community for years. You see the 2, the Narrows and the Gowanus, the ones that are privately owned, are over 50 years old, and they've been polluting the community for decades. And on the heels of the pulling of their repowering application was also the announcement to building land-based battery storage projects in the place of these plants. And so these are really big victories that don't happen overnight. There's so many fingerprints all over these victories. We're so happy and really honored to be working with such great partners and technical assistance providers as many on the call today. And then went one too far. Let's see. And lastly, I just want to end with what we're fighting for. So we're not just fighting for, the closing of these peaker plants, but we're fighting for a true just transition. And so here are some of the examples of what that looks like here in Sunset Park. So it looks like a green reindustrialization of the waterfront. It looks like climate resilient local supply chains. It looks like access to training, certification, and education for green job career pathways. It looks like stopping gentrification and displacement and strengthening social cohesion in the face of climate change. And it looks like building a different kind of energy system. One of our partners always says we can't let big oil become big renewable energy, and that is going to be true forever and ever, and that the systems for renewable energy that we are building need to be community owned, community developed, and really be building for true community wealth and health. And so I'm going to stop there. I know we're short on time, and just say thank you so much for having me again. If you'd like to keep in touch and learn more about Peak Coalition UPROSE's work, here are all the links and the information. I'm going to stop there and pass it over to Rosemary, but thank you again.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Rose Wessel from Berkshire Environmental Action Team's No Frack Gas and Mass program. And a few years ago, we launched on our Put Peakers in the Past program. And we always had a view of going statewide with it, but we started out in Berkshire County, where we face 3 peaker power plants. As you can see, they're located in the extreme western part of Massachusetts, right near the New York border. 2 of them are in Pittsfield and 1 is in Lee. Pittsfield Generating is the largest among them. I'm not getting my slide to advance. There we go. Pittsfield Generating is the largest among them, and it follows pretty typically the profile that Seth mentioned. It's over 30 years old, runs on fracked gas, although it can also run on fuel oil if necessary when stored on site. And as recently as a few years ago, it was operating 5% of the time, and it was 15% of Pittsfield's entire stationary energy emissions, despite that low percentage of runtime. So it's very polluting. The other plants are, Pittsfield Generating also has the added benefit of being directly next to an elementary school. If you see the yellow arrows here between the power plant and the elementary school, there's also a toxic waste dump. So a lot of folks think about the Berkshires, they think about bucolic, idyllic setting, but we're dealing with gateway communities that are heavily industrialized and are dealing with the ramifications of that. Also, a history of redlining in certain neighborhoods in Pittsfield has left an impact that these plants magnify. Doreen plant is very close to Pittsfield Generating. Pittsfield Generating is about a half mile away. It's 51 years old. It's so old that it doesn't have air permits. It's predates the Clean Air Act, and it runs on kerosene. And similar to that, down in Lee, in the southern part of Berkshire County, is Woodland, which is 61 years old, but is basically the same sort of plant that runs on kerosene and produces high amount of NOx as well as their greenhouse gas emissions problems. So one of the problems with the placement of these plants near environmental justice communities is life expectancy. In Pittsfield, it varies as much as 12 years between the lowest neighborhood and the higher, more affluent and more green neighborhoods to the southeast in town. That is a notable change. And while we know that peaker plants are not the only contributor to it, as Seth mentioned, it exacerbates the problem tremendously because they tend to run when the air quality is already really bad. It tends to run during the hot, humid stretches of weather in the summer when it's already really bad air quality in these neighborhoods, and just adds to that on top of it. The way we went about approaching our campaign was to start with raising public awareness. That included media outreach, doing webinars, making sure that news about it was in newsletters and social media, articles in the local papers. We have pretty good rapport with some of our local reporters who really took to the issue. Turns out one of them, her parents live directly next to the Pittsfield Generating plant. We also went on local radio programs and had a petition saying we don't want this to run on fossil fuels anymore. We want to see these plants transition to storage and clean energy. We went around door to door with info flyers and a roadside campaign that we put out next to the power plants saying this plant generates this much pollution. And there's another way we can go about it. Go to our website to find out more. And we also did weekly standouts. And in the weekly standouts, it's okay to get silly. We went ahead and made costumes of an inhaler and a model of the plant with its 3 smokestacks. And it was amazing how much attention that grabbed from cars passing by. The really heartbreaking one was kids going, "I have an inhaler just like that." You could hear them say that. So you know that these are really impacted communities when kids automatically identify with a cartoon inhaler. In the interest of reuse, these costumes are now being used in a fight of a new peaker plant that's being constructed in Peabody, Massachusetts. Waiting for my slide to advance. There we go. Our next step was to build a coalition opposing peakers. These are the organizations. We have 27 of them so far in the Massachusetts Coalition. They come from places outside of Berkshire County, but also largely from Berkshire County. And I think the fact that we got folks from as far away as Canton, which is all the way up towards the eastern part of the state, shows the universal appeal of the idea of shutting down peaker power plants and having them transition to storage and renewable energy. It's a very broad coalition. It also includes many town committees like Sheffield Democratic Town Committee, the Greener Gateway folks in Lee. We had also joining us, we had local officials. So it was state legislators, it was local mayors or board of select members, and local officials, boards of health, sustainability and energy board members. And they signed on to letters that we wrote. But before we got to the point of getting everyone on board, there were some areas of concern that came up. And anyone doing this would need to look out for that, especially among the elected officials. One of the big ones was fear of blackouts, that without peaker plants, we're not going to have enough energy, and that storage isn't ready and renewables aren't ready. There's also is a factor of what I called the Texas panic. Folks saw what happened in Texas when the power grid went down and were afraid of a repeat. So it took a lot of explaining of the difference in dynamics between a grid that is largely cut off from the rest of the country, that doesn't weatherize its energy sources, and the role that peakers play and how easily they can be replaced with storage because of their short run times. There's also concern over loss of jobs. But again, these peakers run so infrequently that most of them are manned by 1 or 2 people, often part-time because there's so little actual runtime. The big one for local leaders was the fear of loss of local tax revenue. And that becomes a matter to discuss with local leaders and with plant owners. So with all of these concerns gathered, there we go, we started a dialogue, and we basically approached the plant owners. These are all investor-owned utilities, so we contacted the companies. We pulled in help from experts like Clean Energy Group, who were great. They also participated in the discussion, and we approached them with the question, what are your plans, given that decarbonization is a mandate over time now in Massachusetts? And it gave them the opportunity to be climate heroes and to do the right thing. And it let them know, we also made sure to let them know that we're willing to work against them in permit renewals if they have that applying to their situation. Some of the difficulties are finding the actual corporate decision makers. When you get into power plants that are owned by investor-owned utilities, there's often many layers of shell companies around them, and getting to who actually makes the decision about the plant can be tricky. We hit some speed bumps with that, but eventually got through. And we also bumped into the limitations of our state's regulations. Massachusetts has taken many bold steps, many bold climate legislation plans have been filed, but we're finding that the regulatory agencies are having trouble coming up with regulations to enforce them. So when it came up for permit renewal for Pittsfield Generating, it was not the obstacle that we had hoped for. Department of Environmental Protection had to come up with regulations to enforce emissions reductions, and they did not have them in place. So the success that we had was with Cogentrix. They were the owner of the Woodland and Doreen plants. They are now converting the three mass peakers that they own. That's one in Pittsfield, one in Lee, and one in West Springfield, to renewables and storage that will be operational by the end of 2023. They're also doing the same for all their other plants in other states. So that's about 22 peaker power plants across the eastern half of the country that are now planning to add storage and renewables. Pittsfield Generating, originally they were not interested at all. They saw their role as solving intermittency by providing power by using gas. We talked them into looking at storage and renewables. They're still not ready to take that step. They can't find a feasible route, but they have been talking a lot with us about what the obstacles are, which has, given us the opportunity to learn what needs to change in the system. So even though they're not transitioning immediately, we consider that a success in what we've learned. Part of it is the energy market for ISO New England, that's our grid operator, is really tricky. There's a loss of injection rights, which becomes a big stumbling block. That's the right of these power plants to put energy on the grid. If they change their mode of operation from fossil fuel to storage, they lose their place. Also, Massachusetts has really strong environmental legislation, but regulations are not in place to enforce them. And the alternative compliance payments and RECs are dropping. The payments for those are dropping, and they should remain the same. Our Clean Peak standard is beneficial, but it doesn't allow RECs when you charge your own assets. So if you have renewables and you need to charge storage, you don't earn RECs at the time you're charging, but you also don't earn RECs from injecting into the grid. So this is legislation that we've been working to get amendments in to change that so that it becomes a more equitable legislative scenario. My slide is not advancing again. Oh, I think I missed one. Nope. So if anyone needs more information, we have a lot on our site. It's nofracgasinmass.com, and look for the Put Peakers in the Past logo on there. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer. I know we're running short on time. So my email is on there, and I look forward to answering anyone's questions.
Thank you, Rose. All right, we'll see if we can get everybody on camera. We do have time for a few questions, and we've got some in the question box. Camera applies to me too. Okay, here we go. This is a question, I know how Seth would answer this, so I'm going to give it to Beat instead. If batteries are charged using fossil fuels, then someone is being affected. So I'm sure you encountered this question in your campaigns. How did you answer that?
We definitely insisted that any storage should be charged by renewables.
How do you kind of monitor that? How do you guarantee, how do you make sure that's what happens?
You watchdog the company for one thing. We tended to form a pretty friendly relationship with the companies that we got to observe what they're doing. I don't know if Jane has anything to add.
I think Cogentrix was a great case where they in West Springfield have enough room to put in a lot of solar. They will be charging the batteries when they have that solar actually generating electricity, so that we're comfortable with that situation as being charged by solar.
And then Seth, if you want to take a pass at kind of answering that at the more general level.
Yeah, I mean, this is the same argument that we hear with electric vehicles. If you put them in a dirty grid, they could make things worse. Well, there are cases where you may put batteries in and they may be powered by a mix of things. over time, the grid's getting cleaner, and those will get to be cleaner and cleaner resources. And peakers are really the worst of the worst. So if you knock out peakers, you are almost invariably going to be using something cleaner. Now, it's not great to be impacting another community, but you got to take it one step at a time, and batteries do help enable that flexibility.
All right, I'm gonna toss this one to Summer. Are most of these peakers in places that have enough space to put centralized solar where the plant was previously? And I know that's been an issue in New York.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a really big issue, especially in New York City where you don't even have that much space for your apartment. So yeah, space is always a really big issue with locating things like solar. I would say on the flip side of that though, that since New York City is situated really well in two ways. One, it's a coastal city, and then two, we have some of the best climate policies in the nation, that there's already so many drivers for renewable energy development. And so there are also big things I didn't really have necessarily time to talk about, but like offshore wind, that's really big. That's going to be providing a significant portion of New York State's clean energy portfolio in the next 5-10 years. And there are several gigawatts of offshore wind that are already procured by the state and in different stages of development, 816 megawatts that are actually interconnect right in Sunset Park at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal.
All right, and Rose, did you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, just really quickly, Massachusetts has the Clean Peak standard, and that's another thing that helps us know that if they charge at a time when the grid is at its greenest, that counts towards the Clean Peak standard incentives.
That's a really good point. Let's see. I'm going to toss this one to Seth. Have any of these facilities announced that batteries were an affordable alternative when they opted for that? Do you have any materials comparing the cost of repowering with fossil fuels versus batteries?
Yes, we do have several materials that we work a lot with a consultant called Stratagen, and for the Peabody peaker that Rose mentioned, we've got a head-to-head analysis for that. We also did a head-to-head analysis for a peaker that was unfortunately built in New Orleans that failed during Ida, even though it was supposed to not do that. They also saw that the economics head-to-head. You can't just look at the cost of building them. You have to look at the operation over time. Batteries can do a lot more than peakers can. They can provide a lot more value to the grid, and that's the best way to really compare the two over time. Now, we don't have examples where these things have been operating long enough to show you the actual data. A lot of folks won't open up their spreadsheets either to let you know. We'll see how these relationships with the folks we're working with materialize over time. If Cogentrix or folks in New York City will let us know what the returns do look like. But in the analysis, it has, and you can go to our website for those. If you can't find them there, just let us know, and we'll shoot to the right place.
All right, Seth, how do in the tool, how are low-income communities defined?
Yeah, low-income communities, you're looking at households that have a household income that is less than double the federal poverty level. So that's how EPA defines that.
And there are a couple of questions about additional information that's in the map. One is the age of the peaker plant in there? Is there a field for total run hours per year, total emissions per year?
So age, no, which is surprising. I wish it was in there. For some reason, it's not. We do have the total run hours, so you can get that from the capacity factor. So if you just multiply that percentage, actually it lists the hours directly. So yes, it lists the hours, it converts the capacity factor into hours. And total emissions, yes, it lists both the emissions rate and the total in tons for CO2 equivalent, for NOx, and for SO2.
All right, okay, this is, all right. So getting rid of peaker power plants is important, but developing distributed energy resources that flatten the peak, of course, is critically important. So to what degree are your organizations, and I'll say all three, working with broader distributed energy policy efforts. Who wants to go first? So we're working on the tools, the policy behind the tools. Jane.
Well, I'll say even before we started working on peakers, we were doing presentations for businesses on how to reduce their peak load and actually financial incentives for them to reduce peak load. So, and we've been working on energy efficiency for a long time.
Yeah, I can add that we've had ongoing engagement with New York State Energy Authority on different pieces, from incentive levels to what community solar programs that they have, but then also on the community level, we've been having ongoing conversations with building owners to sharing how to, what are the benefits of doing community solar, how we can partner with them. And so it's definitely been a very multifaceted, comprehensive approach of how can we create a more equitable solar market, and then how can we work and organize with the community to ensure that those investments and benefits are actually being held in the community long term as well.
Yeah, I'll say replacing a peaker with a big battery is a huge improvement. It's not the ideal equitable solution. It would be much better to have distributed generation and energy storage in communities owned by the communities, controlled by the communities, keeping the wealth, keeping the jobs within those communities. Planetary Group, that is part of our mission, is to do that. We got a program implemented in Massachusetts called Connected Solutions that does that. It's been launched in Connecticut called Energy Storage Solutions, that has carve-outs for low-income owners and things like that. So very much aligned with what we do, not against big batteries, but much more for community development, community ownership.
Yeah, and the other key to that too is making sure that weatherization, excuse me, and efficiency is maximized. That'll cut down demand for anything.
And I'll just throw one last thing in there, and also that all the improvements you're making doesn't cause gentrification that's forcing out the community who did live there.
Yeah.
All right, we're about at time. Is there any question that didn't get asked or any pressing thing that you want to get on the record here before we close out? No? Okay, well, I think we're right about at time. So Sam, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Shelley, and thanks everyone for attending. Thanks to all of our presenters. So let me share my screen now, and I wanted to let everyone know about a couple of webinars that we have coming up. We have one next week through the Clean Energy States Alliance and our 100% Clean Energy Collaborative on the feasibility and implications of 24 states achieving 100% renewable energy goals equitably. Excuse me. And that webinar will be with the Union of Concerned Scientists. So that should be a really interesting webinar. And then in July, we've got a webinar on scaling up solar, the Montgomery County Green Bank and Sonova's low and moderate income solar pilot program. So little solar finance pilot program in Connecticut. So that should be really interesting. You can read more about those webinars and sign up at cleanegroup.org/webinars. And like I said at the beginning of this webinar, today's webinar has been recorded. We'll be posting slides and a recording on our website, and lots more resources on our website, cleanegroup.org, including the peaker mapping tool that we highlighted today. So look forward for those resources in your email inbox, and do check out our website to see what else we have. So hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our presenters. This has been great, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye, everyone.